In modern life, I know three things to be true. We overconsume, overspend, and overdispose. Sometimes I actually think that 2024 could do with a good dash of clothes rationing, or any rationing for that matter, because our high-tech, capitalistic, instantaneous world is stripping us of the experience of going without. Imagine that. And actually, going without, or making do and mending, doesn't have to be negative. I mean, just look at the iconic fashion of the 1940s, genuinely decade-defining in my humble opinion, and a lot better than the 2020s. But how did they do it? How did beauty remain their duty? And how did they conquer fashion on a ration? On June 1st, 1941, the president of the Board of Trade, Oliver Lyttelton, told an audience of millions as they were eating their breakfast that from today onwards, clothes would be rationed. It had been a well-kept secret and came as a complete surprise to the majority of the population. Rationing of food had been in place since January 1940, but clothes rationing was necessary to permit the government to redouble its resources to the war effort. Lyttelton explained that every man, woman and child would be entitled to 66 clothing coupons per year, which would equate to roughly 2/3 of the annual clothing allowance for an average person. And all of this was etched so deeply onto the British public's mind because rationing of one sort or another lasted for 15 years. It began with petrol on September 3rd, 1939, followed by food in January 1940, and then clothes in June of 1941, and the clothes rationing only ended in 1949, but the final restrictions on the sale of meat and bacon were not lifted until the 4th of July, 1954. Over the next 5 years, the number of clothing coupons was cut repeatedly as demand for material and factory space for uniform manufacture increased. By September 1945, the number of coupons issued for the next 8 months was 24, meaning a shopper had just 3 coupons a month for clothes. So if a dress required 10 coupons, that meant 4 months of saving up. The women's magazines were supportive of clothes rationing and tried to encourage their readers to look on the bright side. The editor of Vogue, one of the most influential fashion magazines in Britain, was Audrey Withers. She reminded her readers in her July editorial that Vogue's policy was to put your money into one good outfit and then vary it with accessories. The price of clothes had risen 25% over the course of the first 2 years of war because of shortages owing to the increased manufacture of uniforms and problems with shipping and distribution. It represented a much greater outlay than it does today, thanks to mass production and cheap international labour. For example, an overcoat in 1939 would have cost the equivalent of £1,000 today. One of the other problems of the clothing rationing scheme was that a skirt, dress or pair of shoes required the same number of coupons regardless of quality. This meant that wealthier people could put their coupons to better use by buying more expensive clothes that would last. They also had larger wardrobes to draw on in the first place. In the early 1940s, the average wardrobe of a middle-class woman consisted of 7 dresses, 2 or 3 two-piece suits, a similar number of skirts, 3 overcoats, 1 mackintosh, and 5 and 6 pairs of shoes split between the seasons. A poor woman might have only had 3 dresses, 1 skirt, 1 or 2 overcoats, and 1 or 2 pairs of shoes. And for anybody that's interested in building their own capsule wardrobe in 2024, then you can check out this video. As for underwear, it wasn't replaced as often as I would have liked. Men and women only had a few pairs in their drawer at a time, possibly re-wearing them several times before they go to the wash. However, they were made significantly better and lasted longer than underwear today. But still. And elastic was only permitted for use in women's knickers. There were just 6 designs of underwear allowed each season, and the length of men's socks was restricted to 9 inches. This was so unpopular with the male population that there were questions raised in the House of Commons, and the Board of Trade had to reduce the number of coupons needed to buy men's socks from 3 to 2. I just find it so funny that men kicked up such a fuss that their socks were shorter than they used to be, that it was literally a topic discussed in the House of Commons. Meanwhile, women are rubbing gravy on their legs, but whatever. Alongside clothes rationing, the government reinforced its message that reusing old clothes was the best way to ensure their wardrobes kept smart. In September 1943, they introduced yet another scheme, Make, Do and Mend. A Pathé film on how to make a man's old suit into a woman's two-piece costume was made and shown in cinemas. And endless articles appeared in women's magazines on how to remodel shirts, make shorts for boys out of old flour bags, or turn blankets into siren suits for young children. At this time, women were used to turning their hand to sewing for themselves, their children, and even their neighbours. There are many accounts of wives refashioning their serving husbands' pyjamas into housecoats or their shirts into summer skirts. Everything that could be remodelled was. Only when a garment was threadbare or torn beyond repair would it be thrown away. It was not the case that the government wanted women to look scruffy. They were regularly implored not to let standards slip. And although cosmetics were an expensive luxury, the government ensured that they were available. Hence the entire beauty is your duty movement. Women looking good was supposed to boost the morale of the community, and I guess make Britain look more defiant in the face of such terror and danger. And when there were shortages in said cosmetics, women improvised. Beetroot, for example, was a great substitute for lipstick, and when stockings were in short supply, women painted their legs with colouring and drew a seam up the back of their leg with a pencil to simulate a stocking. And some even used gravy browning as the dye. Women just walking around smelling like a Sunday roast. And although not compulsory, people were advised to carry their gas masks with them at all times. Usually they were issued in a cardboard box with a string threaded through so it could be carried over your shoulder. Retailers, however, were quick to spot a gap in the market for a more attractive solution. The handbag seen here, like many others specially produced, had a compartment for a gas mask. There was also a government campaign to urge people to wear white clothes to make them more visible to fellow pedestrians and drivers. And the blackout and its dangers provided an unexpected commercial opportunity. A range of luminous accessories from pin-on flowers to handbags were produced that would reflect light and help make their wearers more visible. These also included buttons that would glow in the dark. So earlier we mentioned a siren suit made out of a flour sack bag. But what actually is a siren suit? Well, it's an all-in-one garment which could be pulled on quickly over night clothes if the wearer had to escape to an outdoor air raid shelter. Some suits had a stylish twist. This woman's siren suit has puffed shoulders, bell-bottom cuffs to the legs, and a fitted hood. I'm not going to lie, I think they are so chic and fabulous. It also had a detachable belt and piping decoration. A more practical drop-down panel is attached to the rear so the wearer could visit the lavatory without removing the garment. It's basically a 40s onesie. Siren suits were a popular wartime trend with many retailers advertising their ranges. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill was often photographed in his own tailor-made siren suit. In 1942 is when we saw the first utility clothes on sale on the British High Street as part of another government scheme. These clothes were made from a limited range of quality-controlled fabrics. The utility scheme developed out of a need to make production of civilian clothing in British factories more efficient and to provide price-regulated, better quality clothing. Until utility clothing was introduced, the less well-off had to use the same number of coupons for cheaper garments that might wear out in half the time. Utility fabrics and the clothes made from these materials gave the public a guarantee of quality and value for their money and coupons. And utility was again a surprise hit. Here's an example of utility design at its best, featuring simple lines and minimal trimmings. It's a style that could easily be worn today without looking dated. Utility clothing covered a range of dresses, coats, jackets, trousers, shirts, socks, gloves, and shoes. Utility ranges were produced for men, women, and children. And to encourage long production runs of utility clothing, only 15 styles were permitted for infants and girls' dresses. And come the end of the 1940s, we bore witness to Christian Dior's new look, which swept like a whirlwind through the post-war world of fashion and enchanted a new generation of women who by this point were so desperate for glamour and luxury. Since these wartime days over the last 70 to 80 years, high streets have expanded and fast fashion has brought ever cheaper items to our superstores. It's actually kind of hard to imagine how we would cope on 66 clothing coupons per year. Well, as a starting point, we can turn to our wartime ancestors who believed in the principles of make, do, and mend as something to be explored and embraced. And perhaps we can turn those lessons to our own lives and realise just how relevant they still are today.